Good morning. It's great to see everybody here, a number of visitors. I know we've got a lot out of town, myself and my family included, starting tomorrow. We have some visitors with us. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure Veronica laughs. I miss hearing the sound of her laughing, so it's good to have Veronica back with us for the week. So be sure you get to know her if you're one of the many new faces since she's moved away. Now, what we're doing right now as a congregation is considering, firstly, we started with the idea of looking to appoint more deacons. We have 4, and one thing leads to another. When you ask questions about qualified men to serve as deacons, you begin to ask questions about men who might be appointed as additional elders. And so we're looking at both elders and deacons, but this morning I want to emphasize the office of deacon and the character that a man must possess to serve in this capacity. Now, we've already talked about in Philippians chapter 1 and verse 1 that really the local church, as God intended it, is comprised of all the saints. You know, those aren't long-dead super Christians who are given a title. It's every disciple of Christ. We're saints because we are sanctified by the blood of Christ. And among the saints in a local congregation, you have, as it says, overseers and deacons in Philippians chapter 1 and verse 1. So last week we talked about primarily the distinction isn't so much in the character of these men and these two offices between overseer and deacon, because really the character is about the same. The character expectations are about the same. The distinction comes in the nature of their work. That overseers, as the name suggests, have oversight. They direct, like a shepherd leads a flock of sheep. That's the nature of their work, and so among the few distinctions between the character of an elder or a deacon is that an elder is, again, as the name suggests, a little older, and it also suggests that they are primarily operational in the sense of teaching, feeding, shepherding. So it says of elders that they must be apt to teach, capable teachers, because that is primarily the nature of their work as shepherds, whereas that qualification is absent with deacons. And as we noted last week, you look at a chapter like Acts chapter 6, you look at a text like that, though it's not identifying them specifically as deacon in the sense that we think of it in the church as the office of deacon, the principle is essentially the same as far as distinguishing their work from that of the overseers or elders. In Acts chapter 6, an important issue arises. Some widows are being neglected in the daily distribution, and so the apostles, we have apostles there at the church in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 6, they understand this issue is important and needs to be handled by qualified men, by men of good character, responsible men. But they also acknowledge we can't do everything. Our primary work is prayer and the ministry of the word. So we need to focus on that, but they said to the church, let's select 7 men full of the Spirit of great reputation, and let's put them in charge of this. And again, we noted that this was more than just being a waiter in a restaurant type picture. The church was likely nearing tens of thousands, possibly as many as 20,000. So that's easily hundreds of widows they could have been dealing with. And it probably wasn't just people bringing piles of food. It was probably people, as the scriptures even say so, selling their possessions and bringing them money. So these men, these 7 men were put in charge. They were probably dealing with hundreds of individuals and probably handling a pretty good amount of money. So it was a good amount of responsibility that was delegated to these men. But again, they were given this responsibility so that the apostles could focus on doing what they were supposed to be doing primarily. And so the same relationship is true in the local congregation. Elders are shepherds. And so things come up that need to be taken care of that are important. But elders are not supposed to be doing everything. They need to be shepherding. They need to be teaching. They give an account for the way they have watched over the souls of their flock. And so they need to be focused on tending to the sheep. And so other matters that come up that are important, well, those get delegated, if that's the right phrase, to the deacons so that the elders can do what they are supposed to do. That's the primary role of the deacon. They are put in charge of important responsibilities serving the local church so that elders can be focusing on the spiritual aspects of their work. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, the scripture that was just read for us, Paul describes in great detail the type of character, the high level, the high degree of character that a man must possess if he is to serve in the capacity of deacon. And that's going to be our emphasis this morning. I'm going to start with not a biblical phrase, but this is something that, it makes sense in my mind. I call these prerequisite qualifications. I don't really like the idea of qualifications as we tend to describe, 1 Timothy chapter 3, qualifications of elders, qualifications of deacons, because really it's not so much about is he qualified, it's a matter of does he display the type of character that's needed. But I do think as far as qualification, well, I think there are a few qualifications, kind of prerequisites. You have to kind of cross these hurdles first before you can really consider a man in light of these characteristic traits in 1 Timothy chapter 3. And let me just explain what I mean. First of all, before recommending a man to the office of deacon, as our elders have asked us to do, and I think they'll have a little more to say about that pretty soon as far as some little more guidance in this process, but they've made it clear that they want men to be suggested or recommended for this office. But they've also asked that you first speak with that man, partly because you need to make sure he desires to do this work before you would recommend him. Now, in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 1, this is regarding elders specifically, and it says, a man who aspires to the office of overseer, it is a fine work he desires. So we do understand that as far as elders go, we want the desire to be there, an aspiration that they have longed and worked towards this goal of serving the Lord and serving the local congregation in this capacity. It's not that he's power hungry, but it's that he understands, I have been working towards this, and I want to serve. And so desire is a good quality. We understand that about elders, though it doesn't specify the same thing in as many words about the deacon. I just think it's common sense. I think it's just wise to ask this question. It would be really unwise to appoint any man to an office in the church if he is unwilling to do so. I don't think we get the kind of results that we would hope, and I don't think it would just be beneficial for anybody. If a man does not want to, or if a man, for that matter, if he doesn't feel like his character is consistent with what's described here. If a man doesn't want to, and if he doesn't feel like he is, again, of the right character to serve, then we shouldn't recommend his name. So that's one prerequisite I'd suggest to you, is go and talk to these men and to their wives. Go and talk to them first, and just go to discover if they really desire this, if they're willing to. There's room for humility. There's room for humility. If I don't have to do this, but I'm interested, if the work is there, if I'm needed to serve in this capacity, I would like to. We want to find out if they desire to serve in this capacity. And a few others, we're looking for men to appoint as deacons. And some of these you might think, well, that's kind of obvious. But to a lot of churches, a lot of Christian churches, it isn't as obvious as you might think. And we'll talk about verse 11 and what that means when we get there. But there are some people that think deacon is, it's not male or female. It's either or. But I think we need to be clear in our understanding that as we go through this, we're being given a description of a man. He's a man who is married. And he talks about the type of children and the type of father he is. So these are just a few prerequisites. We have a number of good and talented single men with a servant's attitude here. And there's nothing wrong with the fact that they're single. We have a lot of men who are married but don't have children. Very competent, very high character. But that's not what God wants. That's not what he's asking for. It needs to be a man who desires this work, who is married, and who has children. Those are kind of some prerequisites. We need to cross over those hurdles first, and then we hold them up to what's being described here in this text and just consider, do they meet this qualification? Do they meet this description? Is their life consistent with what Paul describes here in 1 Timothy chapter 3? So just understand that. And also as we go forward, the type of character that's described, these qualities, they aren't as simple as you have it or you don't. They come in degree. They come by degree. Some men excel in some of these qualities, but some men, maybe they aren't as high, but we also want to make sure that men aren't completely lacking in these qualities. So it's just remember, this is a very subjective pursuit. I've thought about this a lot when I read these two scriptures about elders and deacons in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus chapter 1. It's always come across to me as a man is only as qualified as the local congregation would think he is. It's up to us to look at these men and decide, are they the type of character that God describes here? We're not looking for perfection. We're not looking for somebody who's never sinned. We're not looking to dig up every skeleton that someone's buried long ago and moved on from and repented of. We're not looking for perfection, but we are looking for men of character. I'd suggest to you, as you're considering who you might approach and ask about being a deacon, I would encourage you to consider the character of the 4 men we already have as deacons, that we thought fit to appoint them, and I believe they've all continued to exude these qualities in their life. So that might be a good starting point. None of the 4 men we have as deacons are perfect, but they are good men. And I think they are everything that Paul describes in this text. So that being said, let's turn to 1 Timothy chapter 3, and let's spend the remainder of the morning looking through these qualities. What type of character does a man need to possess if he's going to serve in the capacity of deacon? Firstly, it says we're looking for men of dignity. We think of dignified, that word brings to mind the idea of reverent and serious. They can have a sense of humor. They can be lighthearted at times, but when it comes to the work that they do, I think professionally, when it comes to the work they do as father and husband in their home, when it comes to the work we would be expecting of them to serve in the local congregation, there is a sense of seriousness about it, that they take their responsibilities seriously. They're dignified in the way they carry themselves. They aren't immature. And again, I think this is especially true when it comes to the work in the local church. And this is somewhat of a summary characteristic, that they are just in general. We're looking for men of dignity, men of reverence, men who are self-controlled, who live a consistent Christian life in full view of their brethren. What I mean is their lights are shining. They're not looking for praise. They're not doing things to be noticed or for the sake of being noticed, but they live a Christian life that anybody can look at and see, well, they're doing things right. They are believing God, and they are following where God leads them. Again, we have to understand these qualities come by degree. There's never perfection in any one of these. But in general, is this man dignified? Does he take his Christian life seriously? Does he take the Bible seriously? It says he's not double-tongued. We talk about this sometimes, that you're one person on Sunday and you're a different person Monday through Friday at work. That you're kind of two-faced, you have two personalities, you're double-tongued. That's the idea here, and that really can't be a quality that we see in a man who would be considered for this office. He can't be double-tongued. He can't be two-faced. He can't have two different personalities. He can't have two different sets of morals. He can't turn into a totally different person when he's outside of the church building. So we're looking for consistency in this man's character. Behind a deceitful tongue is a deceitful mind. We need to remember that. Again, we're looking at what's in the heart, and you don't know what's in my heart as well as I do. I don't know what's in your heart as well as you do, but the only indication I have of what's going on in your heart is what you let come to the surface. The words we speak, they often reveal what's going on in our heart. And so that's why we want a man who is honest, who is forthright in his speech. Positively, there's a negative qualification, but positively we would say that this concept emphasizes integrity of speech, sincerity, truthfulness. That this person doesn't have to constantly throw white lies out there to cover his tracks. That he's not embarrassed of the things he does and feels like he has to lie about the things he does. We're looking for someone who's generally speaking truthful. If you look in Matthew chapter 5, I think this is very important. And another observation is we're turning to Matthew chapter 5. Something I hope we'll remember is that the character, the must-haves, and that's what it says. For an elder, for a deacon, they must be these qualities. They're not optional. But I hope we understand as we read this isn't a different standard. That if we don't want to be an elder or deacon, we can settle for a lower standard. That's not how it works. What's being described here is not a different or higher standard for only those who want to serve. This is the standard for every Christian. The men we appoint as elders or deacons, they are people who have exemplified the kind of character that we all should strive for in our lives. So I hope you're not tuning out this morning if you're thinking, well, I'm a single man, or I don't have children, or I'm not a man, so it doesn't apply to me. I hope you're not tuning out, because this is a great description of the kind of life that we all should want. These are character traits that we all should be exuding, displaying in our daily lives, because we're supposed to let our light shine, and this is telling us this is what a bright light looks like. In Matthew chapter 5, we start in verse 33. Jesus really emphasizes how important speaking plainly, speaking truthfully, how important that is to him. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 33, again, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black, but let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no, and anything beyond these is of evil. That's always impressed me. Anything short of straightforward and truthful speaking is evil. For the Christian, we're not double-tongued. We don't hide our motives. And I like what it says in Psalm 15. All of Psalm 15 is a great description of, a man of God. But I think it's especially in verse 4 when it says, a man who would be near to God, it says, he swears to his own hurt, but does not change. You ever made a promise and then found out it's going to cost you? Maybe I should just back out, take my word back. A man of integrity doesn't do that. A man of integrity gives his word, and he keeps his word even if it costs him. You see that in construction. You make a bid to do a job at a certain price, and then the cost of your supplies goes up, and then you realize, well, at that price, I'm not going to make a lot of money. Well, you're a man of your word. You promised. You gave your word at that price, There's all kinds of situations where, yes, I'll be there for you. You need my help on Saturday? I'll be there for you. Well, I got invited to go golfing instead. That's way more fun, but I said I'd be there. A man of integrity keeps his word. It says he's not addicted to much wine, and here's one that we could spend hours on. A lot of times, people do. I don't necessarily want to. I just want to give you a little bit to think about. There's a lot of debate about this. Just a few verses earlier regarding the elder, it says not addicted to wine, yet for the deacon it says not addicted to much wine. Is that distinction there for a reason? Some people say yes. Deacons don't have to be at quite the same high standard as elders. And again, I don't really think in those terms. I don't think that elders or deacons have any higher, expectation from God as far as their character than anybody else does or any other Christian. So I personally don't think in those terms. And I know the Bible doesn't outright condemn drinking under all circumstances in any quantity. So I'm not going to say that. The Bible, people are quick to point out, the Bible doesn't say you can't have a drink of alcohol. But I like to remind them, the Bible doesn't usually say good things about alcohol either. It usually warns you about how it makes you a fool. It warns you about how wine is a mocker, strong drink a brawler, that it makes a fool out of you. And so I'll just suggest this to you. In my mind, elders and deacons, kind of the overarching quality here is, are they above reproach? They're not perfect, but can you lay a charge at their feet that sticks? That's the question here. They're not perfect, but can you really point your finger at a fault and have that claim stick? A man who chooses to entirely abstain from alcohol, I would say he's above reproach. I will suggest that. Yes, the Bible doesn't condemn all drinking of alcohol, but I think it does bring some question marks on a person's character. That's maybe just my personal feelings on the matter. And so when I'm looking at a man who might be an elder or a deacon, if they don't drink at all, this isn't a problem for me. This isn't a question mark in my mind about their character. So I'll leave that up to you to decide. And ultimately, I think it's up to us as a congregation, and I think the elders, if there is some drinking involved with a man who would be considered, is that acceptable? Again, a man who doesn't drink, there's no problem there. There's no question that he has good character and good judgment in this capacity. And that's something that's always bothered me. You can have good judgment when you're sober and say, I only have one or two drinks. You have one or two drinks, your judgment is impaired. Now you're starting to think maybe I'll have a third or a fourth. And by then, you've lost all ability to, make sound judgment. It's always just best to avoid it. Not fond of sordid gain. As I suggested in the example in Acts chapter 6, the deacons there, or the servants there, were put in charge of distributing food or funds, or purchasing food with the funds they had available to take care of the widows. It was a pretty good responsibility. They were probably handling a pretty good amount of money. And so deacons, they will often, when they're put in charge of a task, they will often be buying things, being reimbursed. They will be, in a position where they might be handling money. And by that I mean the church's money, the Lord's money. So we need to be careful and thoughtful about the kind of men we would want in those situations. In John chapter 12, we're reminded of how dangerous money can be, even to somebody who on the outside has all the appearances of being sound. In John chapter 12, in verse 5, it says regarding Judas, now we have the benefit of knowing his whole story after the fact, but I don't think his friends, I don't think his disciples, the other apostles, I don't think they really caught on to how corrupt Judas was inside. It says in John chapter 12 and verse 5 about the perfume that was put on Jesus' feet. He says, why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor people? Now he said this not because he was concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief. And as he had the money box, he used to pilfer what was put into it. And so where money is, problems often follow. And we need to be careful about this. The Pharisees are described in similar ways, that they rob from widows, that they're a band of thieves, that they loved money, it says in Luke chapter 16 and verse 14. So the love of money, the pursuit of money, has corrupted many, many good men. So this is something we need to take seriously. Money is an irresistible magnet for many people. So we must carefully examine a man's financial integrity before he's chosen. A person who has a problem with greed, who has had problems with stealing, who makes bad financial decisions or bad dealings, makes questionable decisions with money, maybe they're not fit for this office. Not fond of sordid gain. They hold fast the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience, it says. A Christian can't hold to the faith with a pure conscience if they're living in sexual immorality, if they're pilfering money, if they're hating their brother, if they're lying, if they aren't speaking straightforward and in a truthful fashion. I'm going to talk about the conscience a little bit tonight, so I won't elaborate too much more on this, but the idea is a man lives consistently with his Christian values, with the values of the Bible, that there's no disconnect. I like what Homer Kent said on this text. He said, "The great truths of the faith are not to be held as theological abstractions, but are to be properly employed in daily life. To hold the mystery of the faith in a pure conscience is to so live in the light of Christian truth that the enlightened conscience will have no cause to condemn." Again, what this basically means is the Bible is his standard for living, and there's no disconnect. Again, I don't want you to think perfection. We're speaking kind of in generalizations here, but as you consider a man in general, is the Bible his standard by which he judges everything in life, and does he basically and generally live according to the teaching of the Bible? That's what's being asked here. That's what's being described here in character. And it says these men must first be tested, then let them serve if they are found to be above reproach. I'm not going to go into too much detail on above reproach. I'm going to emphasize that a little more when I talk about elders. But again, the concept here isn't that they're perfect. It's not that they're perfect. It's just that they don't have major flaws in their life. That you can't say, look at this. Look at this problem in his life. You make a claim against the man and it's valid. That person is not above reproach. We've all sinned. We've all made mistakes. We've all done things we regret. We've all come from the same place, the darkness that is outside of Christ. So we're not talking about a man who is sinless, never has sinned, and never will again. We're not looking at perfection. That's Jesus alone. But we're looking at, is he above reproach? So this idea of let him first be tested. The Bible says very little with regard to the process by which we would appoint these men. Again, maybe Acts chapter 6 is our best text, where the apostles said to the church, choose from among yourselves. They got the church involved in this process. Said men full of the Spirit, of good character, good reputation. They gave them certain qualifications, certain characteristics, and said, you guys go and find 7 men. There probably could have been more in a church that size. You find the 7 men that best fit this description. And so we understand that the church was involved in this process. And I know that the elders want all of us involved. They want us talking to these men. They want us recommending from among ourselves. So I think this is suggesting that they must first be tested or examined. If nothing else, this verse might be suggesting that this is a congregational process. You know, the elders certainly are directing how this goes. They're giving some wisdom and insight into how they want this to go, giving us some boundaries perhaps. But this is a congregational process, that a man fits these qualities, fits this character description, only insofar as we would deem him to. Again, this is kind of subjective. These qualities are absolutes. These qualities are clearly defined by God, but as far as whether a man fits this description, there's a little bit of judgment here from the congregation. Again, like I said, those prerequisites, well, it's not a matter of if we think a woman's qualified. No, that's different. Again, we're talking about a man who is married, who has children. Can't change those. That's not a matter of judgment. That's pretty objective. But as far as a man's character, he needs to be evaluated by the church. And I think the elders are going to give some time if any of us have objections to some of the names that are put forward. That's part of this process, I think, that's being described here. That, again, we don't just appoint a man without really examining him. Because, well, why would God go through all the trouble to give such a detailed description of the type of character he must have if we don't look closely at his life? Now, verse 11, this one is somewhat controversial, but 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 11, it says, Women must likewise be dignified, not malicious gossips, but temperate, faithful in all things. I believe the ESV version, sorry, that was a little redundant, English Standard Version, sorry. I believe the ESV Bible, it actually says their wives. Now that word that's there for women is the Greek word from the root gune. It has a variety of possible meanings. According to Thayer's, it says a woman of any age, whether a virgin or married or a widow. How many other types of women are there, I guess? I mean, so this is a very generic word, which has led to a lot of varied interpretations. Some would suggest that this is describing the office of deaconess, female servants in the church. They would go to passages like Romans chapter 16, verses 1 and 2. It describes Phoebe as a servant of the church, and that word servant is from diakonos. It's the feminine version of that word, from which we also derive the word deacon. You know, some people want to make the case, but I would suggest to you that there's not really enough evidence in the Bible to suggest that women served in an official capacity like we're considering here with the office of deacon. I'm not convinced that there's sufficient evidence to rule that possibility out entirely. I don't think women served in the church and held an office like overseer or deacon, but maybe this is describing women who would serve in the church in a less than official capacity, so to speak. I've known of churches, small churches without elders or deacons. They didn't have a lot of, manpower, so to speak. And I've known of churches that have put women who are very good with numbers, who are very organized, put them in charge of just keeping track of bank statements and writing checks to pay the utilities. It's not that they're in a position of authority. It's just that they are available, they're willing, and they're very competent to do that work. And they have a shortage of people who are able to do that kind of work. I've seen that before. And I guess in that situation, if you're going to have a woman do that kind of work, why wouldn't you want her to be dignified and not a gossip and dependable or faithful? But my understanding is we're probably talking about the wives of deacons and perhaps even the wives of elders. But again, I hope you don't misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting that this is describing. There is not enough evidence to demand you interpret this as the office of deaconess. Most likely it is talking about the character of their wives. That's most likely what this is, but again, not an official office within the church. And certainly those examples I suggested of women serving in a different capacity, it has to be consistent with other scriptural teachings. 1 Timothy chapter 2 and 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 34 through 37, it describes how women are to be silent and submissive in the assembly. And so, again, if that's the way you interpret it, it's not an official position or office for women, and it has to be consistent with other scriptural teaching. I just thought I'd cover all bases, but my understanding is we're describing the wives of deacons, and these women should be dignified and reverent, just as the deacon is, not gossips. And you can understand, elders especially, deacons, they probably hear more things that are going on behind closed doors than most of us do. Via extension, their wives do. You can see how it's not a good thing for the wife of an elder or deacon who probably hears more things than most of us do to be a gossip. They should be sober, clear thinking, and in general, they should be faithful and dependable in nature. They are to be husbands of only one wife. And again, I don't want to spend too much time on this. There's a lot of what ifs. What about a man who is a widower and is remarried? Does that mean he's had two wives? Or what about a man who has scripturally put away his wife and then married another? My mind is, I opt towards the simple interpretation. It says he is the husband of one wife. A man who is a widower and remarried, he's the husband of one wife. You might disagree with me on this, but I prefer the simple and straightforward approach on this. I don't speak Greek. There's a lot of, vocabulary gymnastics that I've seen done in commentaries about how to interpret this, but honestly, when I read it in different English translations, in the language I speak and understand, it seems plain to me that it's not optional. He can't be a single man, but as long as he's married to one woman, and he scripturally has the right to be married to her, he meets this qualification. I kind of feel that this is, kind of insert in parentheses, happily married, that I would question a man's ability to serve as a deacon if you could tell his marriage was unhappy. Well, sure, he's married, but, I think it has to be probably a solid marriage in my mind, that there's not a lot of fighting. You can see that sometimes, a couple, and that things are not well with them. Yes, they're married, but I don't think that's what's being described here. I think we're talking about a man who is happily married, a good husband, and a good manager of their children. We're not going to consider a man to serve as a deacon that really leaves all the child rearing up to mom, that is generally uninvolved with his children. Ephesians 6 and verse 4, it says, a father is to be actively involved in the discipline and instruction, even nurturing of their children. So in this characteristic, we're looking at a man who is involved with his family, a good husband, a good manager of his children. He's involved in the correction, the disciplining, the instruction, the teaching of his children. It's not something he delegates entirely to his wife. And it also says good managers of their household. Again, maybe with the idea of not fond of sordid gain, we don't need to dig up people's financial records per se. That's not what I'm suggesting, but a man who constantly makes bad financial decisions, who spends money on himself to the point where he has a hard time paying bills, maybe he doesn't manage his household as well as he should. So those are questions we need to think about and consider. Again, some men might be more mature, more dignified than others. Some men might be, these qualities are by degree. So we're looking in general, does a man fit this description? That's the question we're looking at, and this is the description of a man's character that would serve as a deacon. So now it's up to us as a congregation. We test these men. We examine them. We consider if they're going to serve as a deacon, are they what's being described here? One final thought as we conclude the lesson. In verse 13, I wonder if Paul felt the need to conclude on a positive and encouraging statement. It was mentioned in Bible class this morning that a lot of the work deacons do goes unnoticed. A lot of the time they put in and a lot of effort. You walk in one day and we've got new LED lights all around the church building. Took someone a little bit of time to do that. It used to be a lot more difficult to see the screen until somebody came and raised up those two front lights a little bit so people on the sides could see the screen a little better. You might have noticed a clearer picture. Took somebody to come down here, get up on a really tall, scary ladder and replace that projector. Things get done all the time and we don't always notice it. And I wonder if that's why Paul says that for those who have served well as deacons, they obtain for themselves a high standing and great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. What he's saying is it doesn't matter. There's all kinds of prestigious jobs or positions with the government or, with universities or great jobs you might have. You might be famous, on TV or something. He says, but I want you to understand, if you serve as a deacon, you're doing a work that really matters. You are doing something that is truly great and meaningful and eternally meaningful. So this hasn't been a lesson on how to become a Christian, but I hope we all walk away a little bit better informed. As I've studied this over the past couple of weeks, I've got a pretty good idea of God's expectations of all of us and God's expectations of men who would serve in this capacity. So it's up to us to consider the men among this congregation, to go and talk to them. And when names, a final list of names is presented, it's up to us to consider. We're not looking for perfection, but the men whose names are put forward, we have to consider and evaluate them based on this description. But we'd like to offer this a convenient time as we're gathered together and about to sing a song of encouragement that if you have any needs spiritually, desire to be baptized in Christ, or you require the prayers and encouragement of your brethren. We invite you to come forward and make that known right now as we stand and sing.